Hey guys, so today on my stream, I decided to do something a little bit different and spent almost the entire stream just talking about sort of like game design and how we should be thinking about, Runeterra's position in it. Stuff like, why or, what exactly are the problems with this meta? What exactly are the problems with some of the things people complain about, like elusives and Heimer, and what kind of like, most importantly, what the best solutions to these kinds of things are. It ended up being like incredibly long. I covered a ton of topics in these 5 hours in regards to game design. I can't help it. If you've watched this channel for a while, you know that this happens every once in a while. Because game design is a really big passion of mine. But I think that, a lot of people were actually, a surprising amount of people on my Twitch stream were very interested in the discussion. And I think you guys will be too, because there's really a lot to break down here. And a lot that you will learn. There will be a lot that will definitely surprise you. Uninteresting champions are a big miss. Cards like Ashe are supposed to enable archetypes, but they're unplayable. Then you have Ezreal, which is arguably unhealthy and uninteractable. Compare that to Elise, which is so efficient that you almost play her in every SI deck. And my boy, Bone Boy, that was a pal of mine. We played some games together a bit ago. He is touching on a pretty good point that I actually really wanted to touch on. So a lot of people are saying we exist in a low synergy meta. Why is that? What makes it a low synergy meta? I mean, deck building is a high synergy process, right? When you look at deck building, you're like, Heimer Vi, the deck build is high synergy. Ezreal Twisted Fate, the deck build is really high synergy. Kinko Elusives, like every card in this deck needs to be what it is, you can't change much, right? So what makes this a low synergy meta? Well, it's not about the build, it's about the play patterns, right? And sort of like everything sort of playing out in two similar ways. And I want to mention, I say diversity is the #1 objective. Keep in mind, diversity doesn't mean archetype diversity or region diversity. It might imply those things and those might inform diversity. But in reality, mostly it comes down to play patterns. And there's a lot of really bad metas in card games that look kind of diverse on the surface, but everything is just a flavor of something else. And that's no good. Champ level ups suck. Let's talk about how we got here. The game exists as a split between divergence and convergence in terms of strategy points. Okay, the biggest thing is like most of the mini quests are pretty awkward right now. Looks like this is a hot take. I'm actually surprised. A lot of you guys are saying I'm just wrong about this. Let's talk about it more. I'm sure I've phrased this poorly. I'm sure I mean something a bit different from this. Let's break this down. We have a meta of high convergence, right? Of play pattern. What that's going to mean is decks are built around the premise of value and not synergy. Why did that happen? It happened because as more cards get added, they will trend towards more value-based decks. This is a really, really important thing to realize. In a natural state, as more cards get added, the game as its own trends towards value. There's a couple of cards that are so scalable and so high synergy that they're able to scale off of new value. Great example would be Ezreal. Ezreal's a high synergy card that as more cards get added, wow, that card gets much better. For the most part, though, like unless they're specifically adding cards for archetypes, they're adding value cards, and they're making new archetypes. But if they're not adding cards for old archetypes, then, I mean, value just gets a bit better, and the archetypes just get a little bit lower. And then the thing to realize is, like, there's this real breaking point. There's this real split, right? And I compared this to, like, escape velocity on a gravitational, like a planet, right? Which is like for a divergent strategy to make sense, it needs to take over most of your deck slots and most of your plays. And for that to happen, like it's sort of a snowball effect, right? It's sort of a snowball effect. I'll illustrate that by talking about Deep, because I think Deep is a good example of where this goes wrong. So you look at Deep. So every deck build, I'll literally I'll show you guys what a deck build is. So deck builds start as Control F deck building. This is stage 1. What? Okay, whatever. Control F deck building. You know, we control F deep. You know, we put everything in. Imagine we have like learn here. I'll craft it just to make this point. Whatever, right? And then we've got let's see, monsters. We've got toss, you know, saplings. Okay, whatever. I'm not going to question it. Okay. So the Control F deck build in a nutshell is basically this, you know, and the maximally divergent form of sea monsters is that critical mass where Lure of the Depths is worth being a 3 of. That's where it hits that escape velocity and becomes a divergent concept, right? And beyond that, after Lure is a 3 of, then we could be in Zap to tutor for Lure so that we have more hits for Lure, right? That's kind of like, there's a critical mass where you can have enough sea monsters, and most importantly, not the sea monsters, most importantly, enough ways to survive the early game that's worth it. Right now, we're pretty incredibly far from that point. And that's kind of how it works. So you start a deck build like this, and slowly things slip, you know? The first step is we realize Lure's got to go, it's too slow. And the deck needs to speed up. So we got to have it speed up, right? So, you know, then we put in kind of like our ability to stay alive. We've got our grasps, we've got our whales, whatever you want to put, right? And then at that point, we've got good survivability. We're too top heavy on late game without enough reason to be there. So we're going to cut more sea monsters. You know, we can cut the shipwreck order, right? And it's basically, it is sort of a bit like that kind of domino effect, right? That's how convergence and divergence works. Like, we weren't able to get to the point where all the cards combined together in a great way, so we have to start cutting. And once we cut, we cut more and more and more, because once we can't make it a deck that all of it works well together, it turns into a value deck. And Deep isn't kind of the biggest offender of this, but it's certainly the easiest example, I think. And that's an important point when we're talking about like the play patterns and deck builds of it all. Then we have this idea of like these things splitting, right? This idea of like that point where divergence becomes the bad way to play and this becomes the good way to play, right? So as more cards get added, the game on its own trends towards value. And this can be a scarier impact than it seems. Like, if it's just slightly too hard to fit in a good card, then X strategy can suck. And we will see this in... I'll give an example. Do you guys remember my Stand Alone OTK deck? They nerfed Stand Alone. Nerf Stand Alone. I was actually okay with that. Actually, they didn't nerf Stand Alone until later, I think. Wait. No. Okay, they added this card, Grizzled Ranger. And suddenly, because Grizzled Ranger was a good card... This is, again, an extreme example, because Ranger is really fucking stupid in its original form. But they added a value card, and suddenly my high synergy deck no longer makes sense. Because, like, I can't fit in Ranger. So step 1, fit in Ranger. And then, but suddenly now it's like these high synergy cards, I have less hits, they're less reliable. Maybe I should add more value cards. And it all collapses. That's the point. That is why this can happen. And this can be shockingly fast. Like, it can be like one value card that's good, that can sort of like crumble a concept. Now, what that means is just like, basically, as more cards get added, it's important to be kind of like adding more and more divergent strategies as things go to keep with it. I disagree with this point. That's interesting, Precipic. What are you thinking? As more cards get added, it can enable super generic combos? Yeah, of course. I'm not trying to make a statement of the average state of any sampled card game balance patch. All I'm saying is that like the natural state of cards getting added trends towards value, and developers have to add manually synergy cards to offset this. And that's kind of the point. So there's sort of a balance of like high synergy cards or combo cards or whatever you want that they kind of have to be hitting in every expansion or, you know, card edition or whatever to sort of keep things on an equal level, right? My only point here was that, like, unless they do that, which they usually do, and that on average they will do that because they understand this, but like on average, you are going to see a value trend, right? I will say it's not super universal. Like when you look at Magic, there's so many concepts in Magic that Runeterra basically doesn't have. Like the idea of tutoring almost doesn't exist in Runeterra. So I think like this is mostly only relevant for the purpose of like Runeterra's balance patches and like Runeterra's card design philosophy. You're right. This doesn't really apply to Magic at all. There's like too many of the ingrained concepts are too scalable. For sure. Okay. So yeah, I agree. This is not really a universal principle, but applies to Runeterra, and I think is like at least some part of the reason we're in somewhat of a value meta, right? The biggest issue is kind of like a lot of the champions right now are basically, you don't really run them to level up. Level ups are kind of these mini quests. And by the way, I talk about divergent play patterns. By far the easiest and the most prevalent divergent play patterns in this game are the champ mini quests. That's the best example of how to engineer divergent play patterns, right? So I probably should have given more examples of that earlier. Okay. Look at Heimer Vi. Okay. It's using two champions that don't level up. Like Vi sometimes levels up and that sometimes matters. Usually not. Heimer sometimes levels up and that sometimes matters. Usually not. Ezreal, sure. Ezreal happens to be built around leveling. Great. Good exception to that. Kinku elusives. You're not running Zed. Zed is kind of like the old school culprit. Zed never levels up. Braum. There's this interesting thing with Braum where they buffed Braum, but in doing so, they buffed both Braum and Anivia, right? But they didn't make them better at their role. All they did was buff them. And here's the real problem in the last patch, right? Like, when you take things that are meant to be high synergy, and instead of kind of like making their support cards better or making them better at the role, we buff them. That I don't really like that mentality. Braum is better at his role now. Well, of course he is. He's a stronger card now, but he's not. He's only better at his role because he's better at everything. He's better at everything, right? Unless maybe you're saying his role is like a Poro, which I can sort of get down with like a bit of like the Poro synergy logic. I could see that. The point is that this is a large part of the issue. Like you look at all the high level decks. And things don't really need to be flipping. There's a lot of decks. We've seen several decks in the past couple of metas that don't run champs at all. You know, the front side of champions is really good right now. Even like Misfortune sometimes flips it. You're not playing her because she eventually flips, right? That's not part of the reason you're playing her. And so you look at the game, and this is probably where most of the meta feels redundant and not diverse, is because there aren't really champ mini quest decks. Not really. Like, some of them are kind of nice sometimes, but it's just something that kind of happens sometimes. You're not really going too much out of your way for it, right? You look at a lot of the new champions, and it feels like more so than the old champions that this is built into their design, which is, it's something I've mentioned before. It's something I talked about before, and I think it is a bit of an issue. So what we had, like, basically what we had before, you know, when the game launched, they were like, maybe it's kind of like the same ratios. There were like probably, you know, most of the champions are mini quest based. And there were 3 or so champions in the game that kind of really just didn't care, you know, that at least existed on a competitive level, right? Stuff like Elise, stuff like Zed, stuff like Draven, right? That you're just like, you're never, you know, leveling up is just kind of not really part of it. And I really think that like addressing that is pretty key. It's not as if every single champ in the game needs to be leveled up, but it feels like right now there's just not enough of them that care in an impactful enough way, right? Like, it feels like through the expansion and through the nerfs, stuff like Karma getting nerfed, which I'm not saying I disagree with, very important. But through the expansion and through the nerfs, we have a champion pool where it's like most of the there's not that many champions that you're actually really going to be valued in to go out of your way to level. Vi is a card, you know, I really just kind of hate the design concept of this card. And it's not because she's OP. Again, it's never because of power level, you know, and they nerfed her. How did they nerf her? They removed 1 point of health. And it's just like, it's just a big beef card. She doesn't feel like a champion. She really doesn't. Like, even when she levels up, the level up doesn't do anything. She's just a unit. She's like Swiftwing Lancer, you know? And it's just such a missed opportunity. That's probably like the single most obvious thing. This is something I've heard people talk about for sure. Absolutely. I'm not really saying anything new here. A lot of this talk is stuff that I think people haven't really been talking about and should. Right now, I'm basically just, I mean, yeah, people are, everyone's identified this issue. Like, for the most part, there are just like not, the idea of the champions fueling this divergent gameplay doesn't really work. And there's a lot of cards. It's not like Vi's unique. Zed doesn't really feel like a champion. Not really. Like, I mean, he's somewhat powerful. He feels like a powerful card, but a champion? Champions aren't really about power levels. They're, you know, they're about a presence on the board, right? And the best way, as Prezovic puts it, the idea of tension. The tension of this mini quest, which, you know, different champions are going to have different degrees of mini quests that are going to be differently payoffed, differently enabled, different levels of importance. Sure. But there should still be something. And especially like after the nerfs, a couple of the additions and some of the buffs, you know, I think it's fine for Darius to be the way he is. I think this is actually totally okay. I mean, especially like he's a pretty basic card. There's nothing really wrong with having some things that are pretty vanilla. But like looking at Anivia and Braum and how they buffed them, I don't like that direction. And there are also a lot of champions that I really feel like should be leveling more often. A big one is Quinn. It's totally fine to have some champions be harder to level than others, and for some to, like, you know, be easier to level than others, and the payoff basically maybe scaling proportionally. That's kind of fine, but like the idea of a champion who's just kind of like not completely abandoned the concept of leveling, because not only is this payoff really hard, but it's also like not even really usually worth going out of your way. And that's like it feels like it creates these overly convergent play pattern metas where we don't have a lot of the things that could make a lot of the different games unique and interesting, right? And that's what creates boredom or disinterest. That's kind of probably the biggest culprit. Okay, that's a fairly straightforward point, right? So there's not too much to talk about that. It's just like make them higher synergy. That's it, right? And a lot of them are fine. A lot of them, their biggest problem is like the archetype they fit into is kind of lacking. Okay, next topic. Keep them coming, keep it coming. We can do this all day. A lot of decks that had staying power are just downright degenerate or unfun to play against. I can't think of any matchups that were fun. Okay, so this is kind of like what a lot of people are identifying that are just like the decks that are being played are just unfun. This is just an amalgamation of everything we've said. Like, all the finishers are super low tension. All the games feel somewhat samey. There's less like divergence, so things are just gonna be like kind of like a slog. What I will say, by the way, is I would like Runeterra to have a few more tutors effects. I probably don't want as many as something like Magic has, for sure. Tutor effects basically allow you to take specific cards from your deck and allow a higher degree of reliability over certain things. I think, again, everything needs to be balanced. There's always the existence of two things, which is two concepts that will always exist. Not enough and too much. These are both concepts that exist. There's such a thing as both. And we might disagree about exactly where it should be. I don't think the game should have a ton of tutors. I actually think that, I've played Gwent, and Gwent had a problem where it had too many, for sure. But both directions can lead to boring game states. It's really important to understand that. Like, you guys, some of you guys are disagreeing. Some of you guys are looking at tutors and you're like, well, but tutors just like, they make the games play out too much the same way. And that's true. That's a flaw of tutors. When you can make your deck more consistent, then things are going to be more samey, and that's more boring. Absolutely. Here's the problem. When you don't have enough tutors, then a lot of divergent strategies, concepts that are high synergy, won't be viable, and then you'll have a lot of decks that are just samey, and also you'll have another different way of the game being boring and sort of playing out in a sort of samey kind of way. Again, there's always going to be such a thing as both too much and not enough. And right now there's very few tutors. Now what I will say is I like very specific kinds of tutors. I don't like, I prefer a tutor which has a deck building cost. And a great concept of that is something like Zap. Zap, honestly, is going to seem like a weird example of this, because we never look at Zap like a tutor, and that's because, honestly, he's kind of like, the way he's actually implemented isn't really pushed as a tutor. But in a specific deck, you can make this card draw you whatever you want, right? If you were to build a Poro deck, you could make this card draw you Poro Snacks every time, which is cool. It kind of sucks right now. It doesn't exist on the competitive level, but we're not really talking about balance. We're talking about design, right? And we're talking about the idea of tutors. So the idea of a tutor that is non-specific but controllable is great. I love that. I fucking love that. It's the perfect kind of card to me. It can do a lot of things. It can represent a convergent game plan or a divergent game plan. It is a somewhat of a form of RNG, but a controllable form of RNG, not just from the deck building stance, but from the play pattern. You can build a deck wherein this will give you whatever you want no matter what, but you have a high deck building cost. It's super, super versatile concept. It leads to diversity in both directions. This kind of tutor is, I think, my favorite design concept of any kind of card. I love this sort of thing. Entry does fit a bit of an example, by the way. Because entry, you can cut like a champion from your deck to make entry pull the other one. That design is good. Entry as a card, I mean, I don't think entry's really playable at 2 mana without a body. So that kind of effect could be 1 mana or attached to a body or come with some other downside or come with some other upside. And that's a balance issue. But entry as a concept is sort of similar. And you look at a card like this, Zap Sprayfin. I gotta tell you, man. You look at the divergent concepts. You look at Lure of the Depths, man. And there's a deck, when this card becomes somewhat viable, which, again, we're very far from that happening, suddenly Zap represents a card that single-handedly could enable a unique deck that just really wouldn't work without it. And yeah, it'll have a high deck building cost. You'll have to cut Vile Feast. You'll have to cut Make It Rain. Cards that you might want. Maybe a couple others. Who knows what the game will look like in that card pool. But it's just so good. And this, my friends, is like the kind of tutor I like. There's a third example. Vanguard Redeemer. We don't really think of this as a tutor. I've built 2 or 3 decks in the past where this has been a tutor. You build like all unit decks or all spell decks, and then this will kind of like always draw you the other unit. I've built this with like Heimer and Fiora before. And this is definitely another example of this similar concept, right? But these cards are not really built to be super pushed and not quite enough to single-handedly carry some of the things that they could otherwise be enabling. So you might ask, well, what's the solution? The solution is add some more of that kind of concept. in some cases make that kind of concept more competitive, which for Entry, for example, isn't. And then on top of that, make sure that, you know, the things that they could be supporting are actually even in a range to support. River Shaper? Yeah, River Shaper's the fourth one. Isn't Draven's biggest fan of tutor? Yeah, Draven's biggest fan is fine. That's the kind of tutor that I don't really want in the game. It's kind of like, it's pretty lazy. It's honestly, Draven's biggest fan is more of like a humor card than anything else. It's funny. Like, it's got hilarious voice lines and stuff. Bjerg? Yeah, Bjerg too. So there's a handful, don't get me wrong. But it's not quite... Most of them have a higher deck building cost than they should, or, you know, the thing is just not worth doing. They're just kind of not able to do what they want to do. And that's... So if you guys had a knee-jerk when I said we should add more tutors, I don't mean like... I'm not envisioning Magic the Gathering. You know, like... Okay. We can talk about reach. So the question is, and I have avoided really talking too much about this. So the suggestion is a mechanic in Magic the Gathering. It was called reach, which is the concept of can block elusive. It's just the keyword that says I can block elusive. Now, is this a good thing for the game? Honestly, it might be fine. I've heard that some people think it'll like balance elusives, and it definitely won't. It definitely wouldn't like put elusives in their place. You usually can't really exist to count it. Okay, look, listen. So people do this fucking thing where I'm gonna go a little bit deeper about this. People do this thing where they think that just adding counters nerfs things, and that kind of like often doesn't work in card games. It can work in certain kinds of games. If you imagine like a MOBA, like if there's a champion that's strong and then you like add an item to the shop that counters the champions, I mean, that makes sense. That's fine. In a card game, that usually doesn't work like at all. All you're doing is forcing a rock, paper, scissors scenario by doing that. And so balancing around with this idea is never great. It's not as if, again, the mechanic might be fine. I remember in Artifact, there was a Reddit post, very unironic, made it to the front page. It said verbatim, how can people complain about cheating death and simultaneously not run Pugna? This isn't like a joke. Like, this is actually something people said. So, I mean, if you don't know Artifact, you can actually figure out exactly what this is by context. You don't need to know Artifact. Cheating death is a high power thing. Pugna counters it. Pugna's a weak card. You can infer all of that without knowing anything about Artifact. It's a really, really funny statement. The problem is, like, card games don't really work like that. Like, a weak card can't counter a strong card because you won't play the weak card, because the strong card isn't always going to be what your opponent's playing, right? It's not a side shop. It's not like a shop in a MOBA. It's very different. Like, you can't run this card. And in theory, you could at a certain point in the meta. You know, the meta will balance, and if cheating death has like an 80% share of the meta, you know, if cheating death decks are 80% of the meta, then I guess in a ridiculous enough circumstance, yeah, you could do things like this, but that's never going to be what you want. And you might say, well, Swim, if you make Pugna better, then the threshold at which cheating death decks would have to overtake the meta for Pugna to see play would be more reasonable. And that is true. But it also, that's not even really the point. Okay, so let's say cheating death is like a 20% share of the meta. So 20% of people queuing are playing it, okay? Pugna is good enough that you are priced into running it at this 20% share. I guess I should write percents here. But like, all Pugna's doing is just making the meta... A, Pugna's making the meta more rock, paper, scissors, and B, all you're doing is sort of, I mean, you could also just nerf this card, like, and you should. So the idea of like tailored counters isn't great. Now, what is great is things that are more universally counterable. We drew a distinction between Heimerdinger and Fiora being extremely polarizing concepts that can both lead to auto-win conditions. There's a big difference between these. Heimer demands a narrow answer to counter. Fiora can be countered broadly, very broadly. Even without specific cards, you can do certain things to counter her. Like even like avoiding playing units on certain turns or something like that, right? Like the fundamentals of the game can be used to counter her. And like resetting her counter, for example, with something like Will of Ionia, let's just say, you know, there are ways to reset her counter where Heimer won't be countered by that, right? So like at the end of the day, counters are fine when they're cards that are very broadly countered. And again, you know, we go back to what we were talking about before with like Glimpse and Single Combat. These are both counterable cards that can also counter opponents' plays. Amazing, great. And this kind of counter is insanely good for the game. This is like a good use of a counter concept. The idea of a card that counters a subcategory of cards, I think, is basically never a good idea and like a complete meme argument that I hear way too much of. And I think, I don't know, I mean, it probably comes from like other games where that sort of logic would make more sense. Yeah, like the MOBA Shop example, but in card games, especially when there's no sideboard, you can't really do that, right? Magic has a concept of a sideboard where you can swap in a couple of cards between games in a BO3. So you can sort of like run some potential counters and be like, okay, I'm going to swap in some counters to your deck for game 2 and game 3 of the BO3. And that's kind of okay. Like Magic is sort of allowed to print cards that are like this for that reason, you know? And then there's other games like Eternal that do similar things, right? You could even argue Mythgard does a similar thing because its ability to convert cards to mana is, at the end of the day, helps unbrick specific answers, that kind of thing, right? So, yeah, I mean, when you have a mechanic like that, this kind of logic is fine. But for the most part, thinking of like nerf by counter is terrible idea. It literally just like, it not only doesn't fix the problem, it legitimately makes it worse. Like actually, like you're not only are you not fixing cheating death and you're not making Pugna really good, you're making them codependent on each other in a situation that can't feel good no matter what you're queuing into. Like, at the start of the game, at least one card in your deck, some cases a lot more than one, at least one card in your deck is going to be useless. That's a terrible idea. I don't know. I don't know how this is such a popular concept of just add a counter. Like, I need to get that out of the way. That being said, this isn't necessarily saying that the idea of reach, a keyword that blocks elusive, it's not necessarily saying that it would be negative to add to the game. I don't think I would add it, but it could be somewhat interesting. It certainly wouldn't solve a problem. I think it wouldn't solve a major problem. You wouldn't, like, I mean, it's the same with Bubble Bear. Like, you might say, Bubble Bear, like, I mean, if a card has the keyword reach on it, and it's not a card that you would really want to run in your deck, are you going to run that? Like, it depends on the stats and the other value, but, like, you're often not going to do it. Like, and Bubble Bear is kind of the best example of that. Like, of course Bubble Bear isn't going to see play. And of course it's not going to be anything that could be a balancing factor to elusives. Both of those are always going to be true. And even if Bubble Bear was better, it's bad, but even if it was better, neither of those facts change. It still will be a card that is bad and can't function as a counter to anything. I think it's fine. It's a meme card. It's a vanilla card that you look at, you kind of laugh, you're like, haha, 0/6 elusive. You know? That's better than a lot of cards. As long as it's able to evoke something from you, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's just like thinking that Reach will counter elusives is like thinking Bubble Bear will counter elusives. Like, just run Bubble Bear, forehead. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about counters.